Introduction to Web Development. So this slide will cover the introduction to web development. First is an overview of web applications. So web applications refers to all types of applications in which some part of the application is hosted within a web browser. So in other words, to launch this application, we need a web browser. What are examples of web browsers? These are Google Chrome, Firefox, Microsoft or Edge, Brave, Opera. These are examples of web browsers. So the applications that are hosted by the web browsers, like Facebook, YouTube, Lazada, Shopee, are examples of web applications. Evolution of the internet. So not for the past 10 years, but more than 10 years ago, the internet has evolved from a hypertextual information system offering static information. So that means that the information that we see are not dynamic, they're not changed dynamically. So the contents are quite constant. So from static information, then it becomes or it was turned into a marketplace for buying and selling of goods and services. So that's why more or less some of you now are using Shopee, Lazada, Amazon, eBay. So these are examples of this. And now into a widely used infrastructure for the development and hosting of software applications within an enterprise. So the software that are being used by companies now are mostly web-based. An example is the school automate that is being used by our school, University of Luzon. Thus, over time, the internet has moved from principally static page content to dynamically generated content via programs running on web servers. Intranet. What is an intranet? An intranet is a private network that uses web technology and that can be accessed only by authorized persons, usually members or employees of that organization. Again, the school automate is sometimes just running on the intranet. So where it is only accessible within the University of Luzon. So that's an example of an intranet. Now, how does the web work? The browser or client requests and displays information. So yun ang gamit ng browser. So that's the functionality of a browser. So you can place the request and also the browser or can accept the request rather and the browser also displays the information. Browsers make requests of servers, then the servers process this request based on a set of rules, or this is called a protocol. And on the server, a web server software processes the request and returns information to the client. So let's say, for example, you use the School Automate to view your grades. So most probably you'll be logging in, or maybe you're going to enter your student number. So that is an example of the request. And then the server now will process that request and then displays your grades on your laptop or on your phones through the internet. So that's how a web works. So we can also view that using this diagram here. So these are below here are HTML browsers and then the internet. So let's say, for example, you have your request. So your request now will be transported to the web server, so using HTTP, then the web server using server scripts that are accessing databases, forms, dynamic pages will be uh, again processing your request, and then the output now will again be sent to your browsers. Now, the web server can also be connected to other servers. Let's say, for example, we have here a database server and other servers. So again, uh, let's uh, let's repeat that. So the user using HTML browsers will send the request. Then the request will be processed by the server using server scripts, and server scripts can be accessing databases, etc. Again, the server can also be connected to other servers. Then the output will again be sent to the browsers. So you can view now the output of your request. So website structure. A website is typically composed of many files. A website will have the following: maybe an HTML file. So these are ASCII text files. Most sites will have many HTML files. And these HTML files may also include client-side scripting, which is usually JavaScript. So these are some of the things that we'll be learning from this course or this subject. A web page or a website can also contain image files. So these are there are two file formats, but I think now we have more than two formats that are supported by browsers. So here we have examples of GIF and JPEG files, but browsers now support not only two file formats, but more than two file formats for images. A website can also contain object files. So these are files that requires a helper application or plugin. So examples of these are sound files, video files, other plus files, Java files, etc. And a website can also contain server-side scripts. So these are programs for accessing web server-based resources such as databases. So they are called server-side because they are executed on the server, not on the browser. So typically these are CGI Perl, ASP, ASP.NET, GSP, Cold Fusion, PHP, Python, etc. So to show that again in diagram, we have here our a web page, and a web page contains links. So if you click on this link, it may open another file. So if you click on programs, maybe it will open programs HTML. If you click on courses, it will open courses.html. If you click on faculty, it will open faculty.html. Again, a website or a web page can contain images. You can also be using JavaScript for image rollover, or it can also contain links to other HTML files, or it can also contain a link to a server-side script. So once we click on this, it will execute a server-side script. So it can also contain link to server-side script, just like in this case, and maybe JavaScript to validate form input. So let's say, for example, if you type an email address, it will validate if the email address is in the correct format or not. The basic web development process. Excuse me. So the first thing you have to do is to create HTML files. So you have to create this, maybe using a any text editor like Notepad or Notepad++. In our case, maybe we'll be using more of Notepad++. And then after you created your HTML file and typing it in a text editor, you can test it locally on your laptop or desktop to test your web page if it is working properly. Now, if you think it is already okay, then you can now upload your file or files to a web server. So from your computer, you can upload your files to a web server, usually via FTP or File Transfer Protocol. So that's how you move your files from your computer to the web server. So once it is on a web server, you can test the pages on a web server or any browser. Actually, this should be not only web server but also on browsers. So what do you need for the basics? So if you want to develop web pages, first maybe you have to have several web browsers, an HTML editor or a text editor. It's like what I've said, a maybe Notepad++, several web browsers like Chrome, Google Chrome, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, image editor like Photoshop, CorelDRAW, etc. And then maybe we should have also a file transfer protocol software like Qt and many more. There are some free softwares that can be downloaded from the internet to be used as FTP. And maybe optional, we can have a more complex IDE rather than just a plain HTML editor. Maybe just like Dreamweaver. We can also have Flash, but I think Flash will not be supported by browsers later. That's why I think Flash maybe can no longer be used in the future. So media editors like those you use to edit sound, etc. So you can these are the things that you need to create websites or the basics things that you need to create websites. But why do we use several browsers? If let's say you can view the web page using just a single browser. So the original intention behind HTML was that it describes the meaning and not formatting. That is, it is up to the browser to determine the format of tags. Thus, the same tags can be displayed differently on different browsers. So you have to experiment the appearance of your web page in several browsers. As well, Netscape is the maker of Firefox, and then later Microsoft added their own proprietary tags. Many of these special tags added physical formatting, tables, frames, and others. The browsers can vary in how they display pages. CSS and JavaScript in particular vary on the browsers. And you will learn more of this as we go on with our subject or course. So given the different capabilities of the different browsers, it is almost impossible to design a web page that will look the same for all viewers. That's why, again, you have to test your web page or website on different browsers. Strategies for dealing with differing browsers. So number one, different versions for different browsers. So that will be too difficult and time consuming. You have to create several versions of your HTML files. So the lowest common denominator design. So design for the safest HTML standard is HTML 3.2. But I think that's already an old version. So now we're using HTML5. Current version design, designed for most current versions of browsers. Splitting the difference, design web pages that may take advantage of newest features, but are still usable and attractive for those with older browsers. So if it can be backward compatible, then that would be better. Standard-based design, so design pages for current web standards regardless of browser support. So maybe you should also be using CSS and XHTML. Never mind this one. This is already an old data. So also we have to test our pages. Always test your pages on as many browsers as possible. And not only on as many browsers, but also on as many computer platforms. So you can test it on Windows, you can test it on Mac OS, Linux, etc. And now, not only on Linux, but also on your cell phones and maybe your tablets. Static versus dynamic web pages. What are the differences? So most web pages that you view are not static HTML pages. Instead, they are output from programs that run on web servers. These programs can interact with the server resources like databases and XML web services. But for our case, or less, we will not be dealing more with scripts on the web server, but only on the client-side scripts like JavaScript and other technologies on the browser client side like CSS. So static web content, the browser requests index HTML from server, then the web server just responds by sending the content to of index HTML to browser. Then the browser renders or displays the requested content. So just request, just then display. For dynamic web content, the same, the browser requests program from the server, but the server now recognizes request as a program or script. So the program will now run, gets information about the request from the server, maybe interacts with server resources such as databases, and generates response, HTML or JavaScript, that is sent back to the browser. So then the browser now renders the content. Again, the difference is step number three. There's a program that will run on the server side. So that will generate the output. There are quite a number of different technologies for dynamically generating web content. So ASP.NET, ASP, CGI, Cold Fusion, JSP, PHP, Ruby on Rails. So I think in University of Luzon, we might be using PHP or maybe even Python. All of these technologies share one thing in common. They're using programming logic and they generate HTML on the server and send it back to the requesting browser. Web frameworks. More and more web development is being done within pre-existing web frameworks such as CMS and blog engines or JavaScript frameworks such as jQuery. So again, jQuery will be covered in our course subject. CMS and blogs are complex programs running on the server that construct pages by combining content residing within databases on a server with HTML plus CSS templates. While no little programming knowledge is required, HTML and CSS knowledge is still required in order to use these frameworks effectively. So, let's say, for example, after you graduate, you become web designers, but you decided not to code. So maybe you can, or maybe you want to become a blogger. So maybe you can make use of WordPress. So WordPress is an example of the CMS being mentioned by this slide. So again, if you use WordPress, then most probably there will be no too little programming knowledge, but still it will be advantageous if you know HTML and CSS. So again, these are examples of the framework. So we have WordPress, Joomla, Drupal. And I think WordPress is one of the most popular framework nowadays. So template industry. Not everyone has visual design skills. Because of this, there are many web template sites available from which one can purchase or freely use. Again, HTML and CSS knowledge is still required in order to use or customize these templates. If you make use of someone else's template, you must attribute it in the footer and within the HTML. So, of course, you have to acknowledge the owner of the template. So these are examples of outputs using templates. And these are, I think, these are example of websites wherein we can download templates. But in our course, we're not using this. So anyway, I think that will be our introduction for web development. More or less, you have knowledge of how a uh, web page is displayed on the browser, especially dynamic web pages. So that's all for this slide, and thank you.